The night air in Canaan was cool and still, the kind of silence that makes every small sound feel important. A single oil lamp flickered inside Jacob's tent, throwing warm shadows against woven fabric. Joseph lay awake, staring into the dim light. He was 17, old enough to work like a man, young enough to believe every future could be bright. But lately, the looks from his brothers felt heavy, like stones tucked into a cloak. Then sleep took him, and with it, a dream so clear it felt like a message. He saw a field where all of them were binding sheaves of grain. In the dream, Joseph's sheaf rose upright, steady and tall. One by one, his brothers' sheaves turned toward it and bowed. Joseph woke, with his heart pounding. He didn't know what to do with a dream like that. It wasn't just strange, it felt pointed, like it meant something. By morning, he couldn't keep it to himself. Joseph told his brothers not as a boast, but as a simple retelling, because he didn't yet understand how truth can sound like provocation. Their faces tightened. The air changed. Without saying much, they made the meaning clear. Will you really rule over us? Their silence carried anger louder than shouting. Not long after, Joseph dreamed again. This time it was the sky, sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down. When he told it, even his father reacted sharply at first. Jacob questioned him, almost scolding. But then Jacob grew quiet and held the words close, as if he sensed God sometimes speaks through night visions that refuse to fade. Genesis 37. And there was another thing, something everyone could see every day. Joseph wore a special robe, a visible sign of his father's favor. For Joseph, it felt like belonging, like being seen. For his brothers, it was a daily reminder that love in their home felt uneven. The robe didn't just stand out in color, it stood out in meaning. It made resentment grow in places where trust should have lived. Joseph didn't realize how quickly a calling can attract conflict, or how a dream can become a spark in a house already filled with dry wood. He only knew this. Something was stirring in his life. Something bigger than fields and tents. And somewhere behind his brother's eyes, a decision was beginning to form. Morning light spilled over the hills as Joseph's brothers led the flocks farther from home. Days could pass without seeing Jacob's tents, just open land, wind, and the constant work of keeping animals alive. Out there, distance did something to the heart. It didn't cool resentment. It gave it room to breathe. Back at home, Jacob watched the horizon more than he admitted. He trusted his sons with the herds, but trust doesn't cancel worry. When enough time passed, he turned to Joseph, the son who stayed closer, the son whose footsteps were quick and whose eyes still carried that dreamlike focus. "Go see if your brothers and the flocks are well," Jacob said, trying to sound calm. Joseph nodded without hesitation. He didn't hear a warning in his father's voice. He heard a mission. So Joseph set out alone. The road stretched through rough country, past scattered trees and dry gullies. The sun climbed higher, and the air warmed. By midday, he reached the area where he expected to find them, only to discover empty ground. No tents, no voices, no sheep. Joseph paused, uncertain. That's when a man appeared, someone passing through, someone who noticed the confusion on Joseph's face. "What are you looking for?" the man asked. "My brothers," Joseph replied. "I'm trying to find them." "I heard them say they were going to Dothan," the man told him. Joseph didn't turn back. He didn't weigh the risk. He adjusted his path and kept walking. Dothan lay ahead like a silent stage before a storm. From a distance, Joseph finally saw movement. Figures near the flocks. His brothers gathered together. Relief rose in him, and he quickened his pace. He didn't know that from far off they had already spotted the bright robe catching sunlight. To them, Joseph wasn't a messenger. He was a reminder, a walking symbol of favoritism, a boy with dreams that sounded like crowns. "There comes that dreamer," one of them muttered, bitterness sharp in the words. Another leaned in, voice low and dangerous. Come now, let's get rid of him. Genesis 37. It started as talk, dark, reckless talk. But anger has a way of turning words into plans. In that moment, Joseph's dreams felt to them like a threat that needed to be erased. Reuben, the oldest, heard the edge in their voices and stepped in. His tone carried authority, but also fear. Fear of what they were about to do. Fear of what it would mean for all of them. Don't kill him, he said. Don't shed blood. Instead, he pointed to a nearby pit, an empty cistern carved into the earth. Throw him in there, but don't lay a hand on him. Genesis 37. Reuben's idea sounded harsh, but his heart was calculating a rescue. If Joseph was alive in the pit, Reuben could come back later, pull him out, and bring him home. Joseph was close now, close enough to see their faces clearly. He smiled at first, thinking he had found them at last. Then the circle tightened. Hands grabbed him. The robe that once felt like safety became the first thing they tore away. Joseph's breath caught as he realized, too late, that he had walked straight into their hatred. And the pit waited, dark and open, ready to swallow the son of Jacob. The world turned rough in a heartbeat. Joseph tried to speak, tried to explain that he came in peace, that his father only wanted news, but voices crashed over his words, hands pulled, shoved, stripped away the robe that had always felt like warmth. Now it hung torn and useless in his brother's fists, like proof they could erase what made him chosen. Then they dragged him to the pit. It wasn't a neat well with clean stone. It was an old cistern, wide mouth, steep sides, dry at the bottom. A place made to hold water, now holding only shadows. Joseph's heels scraped rock. His heart pounded so loud it felt like it might echo down into the dark before he did. "Please," he started, but mercy wasn't in the air. They pushed him, and suddenly he was falling, arms flailing, catching nothing but cold wind and panic. He hit hard, landing in dust and grit. The impact knocked the breath from him. Above, the circle of sky shrank, framed by faces that looked like strangers. Joseph looked up, stunned. He could see them clearly, brothers who shared his blood, now watching him like he was a problem to solve. He called out again, voice breaking. The pit swallowed his sound, and then they sat down to eat. Up on the rim, they opened food as if it were any other day. Bread, dried meat, water, ordinary gestures beside an extraordinary betrayal. It was the kind of coldness that cuts deeper than shouting. Joseph stared upward, trying to understand how hearts could go quiet so quickly. Reuben was gone for a moment, away from the group. Joseph didn't know the reason. He only knew he was alone. As the sun shifted, something appeared on the road, a line of travelers moving like a slow river across the land. Camels swayed under packs of goods, spices, balm, resin, caravans headed toward Egypt. The brothers watched them approach, and a new idea sparked. Judah leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "What profit is it if we kill our brother and hide his blood?" he said. "Come, let's sell him." Genesis 37. It sounded almost reasonable when spoken calmly, like a business decision, like they were choosing the better option. But Joseph felt the meaning like a punch. He wasn't family to them anymore. He was a transaction. The caravan drew near, men with weathered faces and hard hands. They traded in goods, and sometimes in people. The brothers hauled Joseph up from the pit. His fingers scraped the stone as he struggled, desperate to climb toward the light. For a second, hope flashed. Maybe they were changing their minds. Then he saw the rope wasn't a rescue. It was a leash. Joseph's feet hit the ground, and before he could steady himself, they pushed him forward. The traders looked him over the way you inspect an animal. Age, strength, usefulness. Joseph tried to step back, but the grip on his arm tightened. Coins clinked. Silver changed hands. And just like that, Joseph was no longer a son in his father's house. He was property on a road to a foreign land. As the caravan began to move, Joseph turned, searching for one familiar face that might soften, one brother who would meet his eyes and stop this madness. But they wouldn't look at him. Their gazes drifted away, fixed on anything except the truth. The camels groaned. Dust rose. The distance grew. Behind him, the pit sat empty, like it had swallowed his old life and left no trace. And Joseph, dreamer, favored son, teenager with visions of stars, walked toward Egypt with ropes on his wrists and questions pounding in his chest. Was God still with him when everything had been taken? The caravan moved south like a long, slow sentence Joseph couldn't interrupt. Each step pulled him farther from the hills of home and deeper into land he didn't know. The air grew drier, the nights grew colder. The men around him spoke in unfamiliar rhythms, laughing, bargaining, counting. Joseph understood enough to know one thing. To them, he was cargo. Sometimes he walked, sometimes he stumbled, wrists sore from rope. When he looked back, there was nothing. No tents, no father's voice, no brothers running after him in regret. Just open road and dust, as if the world itself had agreed to forget he belonged somewhere else. In the quiet moments, Joseph's mind replayed his dreams like a cruel riddle. Sheaves bowing, stars bending low. What did any of that mean now? The future he'd imagined felt impossible, yet something inside him refused to die completely. He remembered the stories his father told, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, how the Lord guided, protected, and kept promises even when paths turned dark. So Joseph began to pray, not with fancy words, but with honest ones. God, don't let me disappear. Egypt appeared on the horizon in stages. First the river-green edge of the Nile, then fields, then the outline of walls and towers. Joseph had never seen a city like it. Stone structures rose where his homeland had only tents. Markets buzzed with noise. Foreign gods stared from carved faces. Everything felt louder, heavier, faster. And then came the moment that sealed his new reality. He was brought to a marketplace where human lives were measured in coin. Men stood in rows, eyes dull or defiant, while buyers inspected them. Joseph tried to stand tall, but fear tightened his throat. He was 17, far from home, surrounded by a language he didn't speak and power he couldn't fight. A man stepped forward, well-dressed, confident, used to being obeyed. His eyes were sharp, like someone who judged quickly and expected results. Joseph learned his name later, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard. Genesis 39. The traders spoke. Potiphar listened. A price was named. More silver changed hands. Joseph was purchased. It wasn't just slavery. It was relocation of identity. In one exchange, Joseph was assigned a new life without being asked. He followed Potiphar's servants through streets that smelled of incense and river water, past courtyards lined with columns, into a household built to display wealth and control. At first, Joseph's days were small and humiliating. He carried water, swept floors, learned which doors he could enter and which ones would bring punishment. He listened closely, picking up words, patterns, expectations. He learned quickly, because in a place like this, learning was survival. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Joseph worked with a steadiness that stood out. He didn't collapse into bitterness. He didn't become careless. He didn't treat his tasks as meaningless, even when they felt unfair. And somehow, in the middle of a foreign house, God's presence stayed near. Scripture says it plainly, the Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39. Not because Joseph's circumstances were good, but because God's faithfulness didn't depend on Joseph's comfort. Potiphar began to notice. Results followed Joseph like a shadow. The household ran smoother. The accounts balanced. The servants moved with less confusion. It was as if blessing had entered with the Hebrew boy. Soon, Joseph was promoted from the lowest tasks to greater ones, trusted with responsibility most slaves never touched. Day by day, the rope that brought him to Egypt was replaced by something else, trust. But Joseph didn't know what we know. He didn't see the bigger story forming. All he saw was this strange truth. Even in a land of idols, even in a house that wasn't his, even with freedom stolen, God had not let him go. Joseph's world became a routine of stone corridors, polished floors, and quiet instruction spoken in an accent he was learning to understand. Potiphar's house was not a tent you could fold and move. It was a fortress of order. Servants knew their places. Schedules ruled the day. And at the center of it all sat a simple reality. Someone had to make sure everything worked. That someone slowly became Joseph. He didn't earn trust through speeches. He earned it through consistency. If he was told to measure grain, the stores stayed full. If he was assigned to oversee workers, the work got done. If he was asked to handle money, nothing went missing. He moved with calm focus, like a man who believed his work mattered, even when no one praised it. And Scripture gives the reason in one steady line. The Lord made all he did prosper. Genesis 39. Potiphar noticed the pattern. At first, it was small, an extra glance, a question, an order. Give it to Joseph. Then it grew. Before long, Joseph was placed over the entire household. Potiphar trusted him with everything he owned, to the point that Potiphar stopped paying attention to details. The only thing he concerned himself with was the food on his plate. Genesis 39. To an outsider, it might have looked like Joseph's story was finally turning upward. A slave, yes, but a favored one. A foreigner, yes, but respected. The pit and the road to Egypt seemed farther away, but the next test didn't come from hard labor. It came from temptation. Joseph had grown into a young man, strong, capable, and noticed. Potiphar's wife began to watch him. At first it was lingering looks, then a voice that stayed too long, then comments that felt like hooks. Joseph tried to keep distance. He stayed polite. He stayed focused. He stayed careful. But one day, she stopped hiding it. "Lie with me," she said, direct, bold, leaving no room to pretend it was something else. Genesis 39. Joseph froze, not because he wanted it, but because he understood how dangerous this was. In that house, power didn't belong to him. If he offended her, he could be crushed. If he gave in, he would betray the trust that had been placed in his hands. So Joseph answered with the kind of integrity that costs something. "My master trusts me with everything," he said. "How could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Genesis 39. He didn't frame it as a personal preference. He framed it as a moral line, a covenant line, a God line. But refusal didn't end the pressure, it intensified it. Day after day she kept speaking, she kept pushing. Joseph kept refusing, not with arrogance, not with cruelty, just steady resistance. He avoided being alone with her. He changed his routes. He found reasons to stay near others. He treated temptation like a fire. You don't argue with fire, you step away. Then came a day when the house was quieter than usual. Most servants were gone. Joseph entered to do his work, thinking only of tasks, lists, accounts, responsibilities. She was waiting. She grabbed his garment, fingers tight, eyes hard. "Lie with me?" she demanded again. Genesis 39. In that instant, Joseph made a decision without negotiation. He didn't try to reason. He didn't try to prove he was right. He didn't stay to defend his reputation. He did the only thing a righteous heart can do when the trap snaps shut. He ran. He pulled away so fast that his garment tore free in her hands. Joseph fled out of the house, leaving behind the cloth, and with it the illusion that doing the right thing always protects you from consequences. Behind him, Potiphar's wife stood holding evidence she could twist. And Joseph, breathing hard in the sunlight, felt the weight of a terrifying question settle over him. What if obedience costs me everything I've built? Joseph didn't stop running until the courtyard opened into brighter air. His heart hammered, not from desire but from fear, the kind that comes when you know you just escaped a trap, yet the trap still has your name on it. He stood there for a moment, garmentless, exposed, trying to steady his breathing. Inside the house, Potiphar's wife tightened her grip on the cloth Joseph had left behind. In her hands, it wasn't a piece of fabric anymore, it was a weapon. She called the servants first. Her voice rose loud enough to pull them from their tasks. When they came, she held up the garment like proof and told a story that flipped the truth upside down. She painted Joseph as the aggressor, the threat, the shame. She made herself the victim, and she made sure her words struck where it would hurt most, the household's honor. "Look," she said, "this Hebrew, he came in to mock us." Genesis 39. The servants listened. Some looked confused. Some looked afraid to question her. In a home ruled by status, the safest choice was to believe the one with power. Then she waited for Potiphar. When her husband returned, she repeated the story, carefully shaped, emotionally charged, designed to ignite anger. "He came into me," she claimed, "but I cried out." And she pointed to the garment as if it settled the case. Genesis 39. Potiphar's face hardened. Whether he believed her completely or not, one thing was clear. He could not ignore it. Reputation in Egypt was currency. A scandal inside his home could ruin him. And Joseph was a slave, valuable, yes, but replaceable. Joseph was called in. He stood before Potiphar with nothing but his own voice. No witnesses, no proof, no robe of favor, only a record of faithfulness and the God who saw what others didn't. But in that moment, the room wasn't built for justice. It was built for control. Potiphar's anger burned hot. Orders were given. Hands seized Joseph. The same hands that once trusted him with keys and accounts now chained him like a criminal. Joseph tried to speak, but the decision had already been made. And just like that, the ladder Joseph had climbed, step by step, through integrity and hard work, collapsed beneath him. He was taken to prison, not just any prison, but the place where Pharaoh's prisoners were kept, a fortress for those who offended the state or embarrassed the powerful. Stone walls, iron bars, heavy doors. The air smelled of sweat and old despair. This was the place where stories went to die. Joseph was thrown inside, and the door closed with a final sound, one that felt like the end of hope. He sat on cold ground, wrists sore, throat tight, mind spinning. He had done the right thing. He had refused sin. He had fled temptation. He had honored his master. He had honored God. And still he was punished. If you've ever tried to live with integrity and felt like it cost you, then you understand the weight of that cell, the painful whisper that creeps in when the lights go out. Where is God now? But Genesis doesn't let the darkness have the last word. It says again, like a refrain meant for the broken, the Lord was with Joseph, Genesis 39. Not outside the prison, not after the injustice, inside it. God's presence didn't unlock the door that day. It didn't erase the lie. It didn't reverse the verdict. But it did something quieter and just as powerful. It kept Joseph from becoming the kind of man prison was designed to create. Days passed. Joseph learned the rhythms of confinement. He watched faces, listened for patterns, spoke with care, and slowly, even in that place, his steadiness began to stand out. The prison keeper started noticing what Potiphar once noticed. Wherever Joseph was, things functioned better. Trust grew in the cracks of stone. Soon, the keeper placed Joseph over other prisoners, giving him responsibility inside confinement itself. Genesis 39. Joseph had lost his freedom, but he had not lost his calling. And in the shadowed halls of that prison, God was already setting the stage for the next turn, one Joseph could not possibly imagine. Prison life has a way of shrinking time. Days blur into each other, meals, chains, footsteps in the corridor, the scrape of a door. Yet inside those walls, Joseph learned something rare, how to stay steady when nothing around you is. He didn't become bitter. He didn't turn cruel to survive. He worked, organized, listened. The warden trusted him so much that Joseph moved through the prison with unusual freedom, overseeing tasks and tending to needs. It wasn't real liberty, but it was purpose, and purpose kept his heart from collapsing. Then one morning, the routine broke. 2 new prisoners were brought in under heavier guard than most. Their clothes were better. Their posture carried the memory of palace life. They weren't common criminals. They were officials, men who had served close to Pharaoh himself, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Genesis 40. Whispers traveled fast in a prison. People wanted to know what they had done, how long they would stay, whether Pharaoh's anger would fade. Joseph watched them quietly. These men carried fear behind their pride, the fear of knowing that one decision by a king could end your life or restore it. That night, both men dreamed, and in the morning, Joseph noticed their faces. Something was off. Eyes unsettled, shoulders tense, the look of men haunted by an invisible message. "Why do you look so troubled today?" Joseph asked. They exchanged a glance. "We've had dreams," they said, "and there's no one to interpret them." Genesis 40. In Egypt, dreams weren't just imagination. They were treated like signals, warnings, clues from the spiritual world, and when powerful men dreamed, it mattered. But here they were, locked away, cut off from the court experts, left with questions that wouldn't let them breathe. Joseph took a slow breath. He could have shrugged. He could have protected himself. After all, dreams had already brought him pain. But Joseph had learned something in the pit, on the road, in Potiphar's house, and now in prison. God could speak even when life felt unfair. So he answered with humility, not ego. "Do not interpretations belong to God?" he said. "Tell me your dreams." Genesis 40. The cupbearer spoke first. He described a vine with 3 branches. It budded, blossomed, and produced ripe grapes. In the dream, he took Pharaoh's cup, squeezed the grapes into it, and placed the cup into Pharaoh's hand. Joseph listened carefully, not rushing. Then he spoke with calm clarity. "The 3 branches are 3 days," he said. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position." Genesis 40. Hope flashed across the cupbearer's face. Hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel since entering the cell. Then the baker, encouraged, shared his dream. He saw 3 baskets of bread on his head, baked goods for Pharaoh, but birds came down and ate from the baskets. Joseph's expression tightened. He didn't want to hurt this man. But Joseph had learned that God's truth isn't ours to soften when it comes with weight. "The 3 baskets are 3 days," Joseph said. "In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you." Genesis 40. The baker's hope drained into silence. The cell felt colder. Joseph didn't gloat. He didn't dramatize. He simply spoke what he believed God had shown him. Then, turning to the cupbearer, the one with a future, Joseph made a request. It was not greedy. It was human. "Remember me when it goes well with you," he said. "Show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this place." Genesis 40. Because Joseph knew something else too. He didn't belong in that prison. He had done nothing to deserve it. And 3 days later, on Pharaoh's birthday, everything unfolded exactly as Joseph had said. The cupbearer was restored. The baker was judged. Genesis 40. One man returned to the palace. One remained behind bars. And Joseph waited, holding on to a fragile thread. Maybe now, someone will finally speak my name. Hope can be a dangerous thing in prison. After the cupbearer left, Joseph replayed their conversation again and again. "Remember me. Those words echoed like a small candle in a dark room. For the first time in a long time, Joseph could imagine the door opening for him, not by a miracle of lightning and thunder, but by something simple, one man telling the truth in the right place. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and the candle burned lower. The prison routine returned like a tide. Chains clinked, guards shouted, the same walls stared back at Joseph. Every time footsteps approached his section, his heart lifted, then sank when the guard walked past. Every time he heard news from outside, he listened for one thing, his name. It never came. Genesis says it plainly, almost painfully. The cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. Genesis 40. Not because Joseph wasn't valuable, not because Joseph didn't help him, but because life moves on fast when you've escaped trouble. When you're safe again, the suffering of the forgotten becomes easy to set aside. So Joseph waited, and waiting did something to him. It tested the deepest part of his faith, not his ability to interpret dreams, but his ability to trust God when nothing changed. It's one thing to believe when doors open. It's another to believe when the door stays shut and silence grows louder than prayer. Then, 2 full years later, the world shifted again. Far above Joseph's cell in the palace of Egypt, Pharaoh himself had a dream. He stood by the Nile, watching the river that fed the whole nation. In his dream, 7 sleek, healthy cows came up from the water and grazed among the reeds. Then 7 other cows emerged, thin, ugly, starving, and they ate the healthy ones. Pharaoh woke up, shaken. He fell asleep again and dreamed a second dream. 7 plump heads of grain grew on one stalk, beautiful and full. Then 7 thin, scorched heads sprouted and swallowed the good ones. Pharaoh woke up again, disturbed, unsettled, certain these dreams carried a warning. In Egypt, a king's dreams were not dismissed. Pharaoh summoned his magicians and wise men. They listened, they offered guesses, they spoke with confidence, but none of them could explain what it meant. Genesis 41. Pharaoh's frustration grew. A powerful man can handle armies, taxes, and temples, but he cannot control a message that comes from beyond him. That's when the cupbearer's memory snapped awake like a cord pulled tight. He stepped forward carefully because admitting past failure in front of Pharaoh was risky, but the fear of Pharaoh's unanswered dream was greater. "I remember my offenses today," the cupbearer said. And he told Pharaoh about the prison, about the 2 dreams, about the Hebrew young man who interpreted them, and how everything happened exactly as he said. Genesis 41. For Joseph, the palace conversation was invisible. He didn't hear the cupbearer speaking. He didn't see Pharaoh's eyes narrowing with interest. All Joseph knew was that on an ordinary day, like all the others, guards suddenly appeared at his cell. "Come out," they ordered. Joseph stood, confused. Prisoners don't get summoned without reason. He expected punishment, or transfer, or worse. Instead, they rushed him to be cleaned. His hair was trimmed, his beard shaved, he was given fresh clothing. In minutes, the image of a prisoner was stripped away, and Joseph looked again like a young man who could stand before royalty. Then the doors opened into a corridor brighter than anything he had seen in years. Joseph's steps echoed as he was led forward, and suddenly the impossible was happening. The forgotten slave was being brought before the most powerful man on earth. Joseph's heart raced, not with pride, but with awe, because he realized something in that moment. The delay wasn't the end of the story. The delay was part of the setup, and now, in a single day, God was about to lift Joseph from the lowest place to a turning point that would change nations. Joseph was led into Pharaoh's presence like a man stepping into another world. The palace air smelled of incense and polished stone. Light reflected off gold and carved surfaces, and every servant moved with practiced precision. This wasn't Potiphar's house. This was the heart of Egypt. Pharaoh sat above him, calm, unreadable, surrounded by officials who spoke softly and watched closely. Joseph felt every eye. A Hebrew prisoner, brought in with no warning, standing before a king who could decide his fate with a single gesture. Pharaoh studied him. Then he spoke. "I have heard it said of you," Pharaoh began, "that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Genesis 41. It was the kind of statement that could tempt any man to claim credit. Joseph had every reason to say, "Yes, I can." He could have tried to impress, to secure his freedom, to build a future on his gift. But Joseph didn't stand on ego. He stood on God. "It is not in me," Joseph answered. "God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Genesis 41. That sentence carried weight. It wasn't fear, it was faith. Joseph refused to take ownership of what belonged to the Lord, and in doing so, he showed Pharaoh something rare, a man who could be trusted with power because he didn't worship himself. Pharaoh described his dreams in detail: the 7 healthy cows, the 7 sickly ones, the 7 full heads of grain, the 7 thin and scorched. He spoke like a man trying to hold a message that kept slipping away. Joseph listened without interrupting. His face remained calm, but inside, something clicked into place. The dreams weren't random. They were one message repeated twice to confirm certainty. Joseph recognized the pattern not just as a dream interpreter, but as a man who had lived long enough to know God's warnings come with mercy. He began to speak. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one," Joseph said. "God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do." Genesis 41. Then Joseph explained, 7 years of great abundance were coming to Egypt, harvests so rich the land would overflow. But after them would come 7 years of severe famine, so harsh that the abundance would be forgotten. The famine would consume the land like a fire consumes dry grass. The reason the dream came twice, Joseph said, was because the matter was established by God, and God would bring it to pass soon. Genesis 41. The room went quiet. Joseph's words weren't flattering. They weren't a performance. They were a forecast that could shake an empire. Pharaoh's advisers listened, their expressions shifting. Some looked alarmed, some skeptical, some impressed. But Pharaoh remained focused, because deep down he knew the interpretation carried truth. It matched the dread he'd felt when he woke up. Then Joseph did something no prisoner was expected to do. He offered counsel. "Now, therefore," Joseph said, "let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt." Genesis 41. He outlined a plan, practical, specific, urgent. During the 7 good years, Egypt should collect and store a portion of the harvest. Grain should be gathered into cities, protected, organized, preserved. Then when famine came, the nation would have reserves to survive. It was brilliant, not complicated, but wise. It turned fear into preparation. It treated the dream as a gift, not a curse. Pharaoh looked around at his officials. They were the experts of Egypt, the trained minds, the seasoned administrators. Yet none of them had offered clarity like this Hebrew man. And Pharaoh asked a question that hung in the air like a verdict. "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Genesis 41. Joseph stood still, not daring to assume what came next. But something was shifting in the palace, something bigger than Joseph's freedom. A king was looking at a prisoner and seeing a leader. The room held its breath. Pharaoh's officials exchanged quick looks, some surprised, some uneasy. In Egypt, power was protected. Titles were earned through lineage, loyalty, and long years of service. Yet here stood a Hebrew former slave, speaking with clarity none of them had reached. Pharaoh leaned forward. His voice cut through the silence. "Since God has shown you all this," he said, "there is none as discerning and wise as you." Genesis 41. Joseph's chest tightened. He had walked in expecting judgment, and now Pharaoh was speaking like a man ready to hand him authority. It didn't feel real, not after the pit, not after the chains, not after 2 years of silence. Pharaoh continued, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word." Genesis 41. Then came the line Joseph could barely process. "Only in the throne will I be greater than you." In one decision, Pharaoh lifted Joseph from prisoner to governor, second only to the king himself. Servants stepped forward with royal symbols. Pharaoh took his signet ring, the ring used to authorize decrees, and placed it on Joseph's hand. Fine garments replaced prison cloth. A gold chain was set around his neck. Genesis 41. Joseph stood there, stunned. The ring felt heavy, not in weight, but in meaning. With it came the ability to command, to open storehouses, to move resources, to reshape a nation's future. Then Pharaoh gave Joseph a new name, an Egyptian title marking his new status, and arranged a marriage for him within the land. Joseph, once the rejected brother, was now woven into Egypt's highest ranks. Genesis 41. And then Pharaoh did something that sealed it publicly. He placed Joseph in a chariot and sent him through the streets. Runners went ahead, calling out for people to bow. Crowds turned. Merchants paused. Workers looked up from their labor. A ripple of astonishment moved across the city. Joseph, Hebrew outsider formerly chained, passed by, clothed in honor. Not long ago, his brothers had mocked him as the dreamer. Now the dream was taking shape in a way no one could have planned. But Joseph didn't let the moment intoxicate him. He didn't treat power like revenge. He treated it like responsibility. The years of abundance began exactly as God had shown. Fields near the Nile produced in overwhelming measure. Grain filled the air with the smell of harvest. Storehouses expanded. Teams worked day and night. And Joseph organized it all with focused discipline. Genesis says the harvest was so plentiful it was like the sand of the sea, beyond counting. Genesis 41. Joseph traveled across Egypt, inspecting, planning, assigning. He built systems, not just stockpiles. He positioned grain in cities across the land so when crisis came, help would be near. And in the middle of all this, Joseph's personal life grew too. 2 sons were born to him. He named the first Manasseh, saying God had made him forget his hardship and his father's house. He named the second Ephraim, saying God had made him fruitful in the land of his affliction. Genesis 41. Those names were more than labels. They were testimony. Manasseh, God healed my memories. Ephraim, God gave me growth in the place that hurt me. Joseph was building a future, but he hadn't erased the past. The wounds were still part of him. Yet now they were being transformed into wisdom. Wisdom that would soon be tested. Because the 7 good years were not forever. And when the 7th year ended, the air began to change. The land that had overflowed started to tighten. The warning Joseph had spoken in Pharaoh's throne room was moving from prophecy to reality. The famine was coming, and soon it wouldn't only reach Egypt. It would reach the very family Joseph left behind. The shift didn't happen all at once. At first it was small. Harvests that felt lighter, fields that didn't look as rich, merchants who spoke a little more carefully. Then the Nile's rhythm seemed to falter, and the land that once overflowed began to tighten its grip. Soon it was undeniable. The famine came, heavy, spreading, relentless. Egypt, with all its strength, felt the pinch like everyone else. People started lining up, asking questions, fearing the worst. And as hunger grew, the memory of abundance faded fast, just as Joseph had warned. When the pressure rose, Pharaoh pointed the nation toward one place. "Go to Joseph," he said. "What he says to you, do." Genesis 41. So the storehouses opened. Joseph stood at the center of the storm, not with a sword but with keys. Grain was measured out. Systems were enforced. The lines moved. The city breathed again, because someone had prepared before the crisis arrived, and the famine didn't stop at Egypt's borders. Like a shadow spreading across the map, it reached Canaan, Joseph's homeland. Fields dried, herds weakened. Families looked at empty bins and did the math of survival. Jacob's household felt it too, the same tents, the same hills, but now the land could not provide. One morning, Jacob looked at his sons, grown men now, restless, worried, hungry. His voice carried frustration and urgency. "Why do you just keep looking at one another?" he said. "I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy for us, that we may live and not die." Genesis 42. The words landed like command and warning in one. So 10 brothers prepared to travel. 10, not 11. Benjamin stayed behind. Jacob's heart still guarded the youngest like a fragile treasure. Joseph was gone, lost in Jacob's mind, likely dead. He could not bear to risk Benjamin too. "If harm happens to him," Jacob feared, "you will bring my gray hair down in sorrow." Genesis 42. So the brothers left, heading toward the very nation where their brother now held power. They didn't know that each step was pulling them toward the past they buried. They didn't know the grain they needed was in the hands of the one they sold. They didn't know the dreams were waiting for their next chapter. Egypt was crowded with outsiders, people from many lands, all coming for food. The brothers entered the city among strangers, dust on their clothes, worry in their eyes. They asked where to go, where grain was sold, where mercy might be found, and they were directed to the governor, to Joseph. When they arrived, they didn't recognize him. How could they? The boy they betrayed had become a man. He dressed like an Egyptian ruler. He spoke with authority. His face carried years they hadn't seen. He was surrounded by officials. He was the one everyone bowed to. But Joseph recognized them instantly. 10 familiar faces, older, rougher, weathered by life. The sight hit him like a wave. Memory, pain, longing, and something sharp that rose in his throat. For a brief moment, the palace, the power, the years in between, all of it blurred under one truth. My brothers are here. And then the old dream stood up in his mind like it had never left. Sheaves, bowing, stars, bending low. Because when the brothers approached the governor, they did what protocol demanded. They bowed with their faces to the ground. Genesis 42. The dream wasn't a fantasy anymore. It was happening. Joseph looked down at them, his expression controlled, his heart racing. He could have revealed himself in an instant. He could have punished them. He could have sent them away. But Joseph wasn't just facing men who wronged him. He was facing the question of who they had become. So Joseph chose a path that would test their hearts before he touched their fate. And in a voice they didn't recognize, he spoke like a ruler. "Where do you come from?" Genesis 42. The brothers lifted their heads, trembling slightly, and answered, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph, his identity hidden, his emotions locked behind royal calm, began the trial that would reveal whether repentance had grown where cruelty once lived. Joseph's face stayed composed, but inside everything stirred. These were the same men who had stood above a pit and eaten while he begged. Now they stood below him, hungry, vulnerable, asking for mercy, without realizing whose mercy it was. He could have ended the story right there with one sentence, "I am Joseph." But Joseph didn't only want a reunion. He needed to know if their hearts had changed. Time can soften guilt or harden it into denial. Joseph wasn't interested in words. He was about to test fruit. So he spoke harshly, like an Egyptian official guarding national security. "You are spies," he said. "You have come to see the nakedness of the land." Genesis 42. The accusation hit them like cold water. They raised their hands in protest, voices overlapping. "No, my lord, we are your servants, come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. We are not spies." Genesis 42. Joseph watched their reactions closely. Fear makes people reveal themselves. Pride argues. Humility pleads. The brothers looked genuinely shaken. Joseph pressed harder. "No," he insisted, "you have come to see the weakness of the land." Genesis 42. Cornered, the brothers offered details, more than Joseph asked for. It came spilling out, almost as if the truth needed air. "We are 12 brothers," they said, "sons of one man in Canaan. The youngest is with our father today, and one is no more." Genesis 42. One is no more. Joseph absorbed the words like a slow burn. They spoke of him as dead, finished, erased. The phrase carried years of grief in just a few syllables. Yet he didn't flinch, not outwardly. Instead, Joseph tightened the test. "By this you shall be proven," he said. "Send one of you to bring your youngest brother. The rest will remain confined." Genesis 42. Then he had them placed in custody for 3 days. 3 days, long enough for fear to settle, long enough for conscience to wake up. In the silence of confinement, memories return. Regret gets loud. On the 3rd day, Joseph adjusted the terms, not to destroy them, but to draw out their hearts. "Do this, and you will live," he said, "for I fear God." Genesis 42. That line was subtle but powerful. An Egyptian ruler speaking of fearing God. It was a crack in the mask, a hint that this man's authority was guided by something higher than politics. Joseph continued, "One brother would stay behind as security. The others could return home with grain, but they must bring back the youngest brother to prove their honesty." As the brothers talked among themselves, they didn't realize Joseph could understand their language. They assumed he needed an interpreter. And that's when Joseph heard the words he had waited years to hear, though he never expected them to come out like this. "Surely we are guilty," one brother said, voice low, heavy. "We saw his distress when he pleaded with us, and we would not listen." Genesis 42. Another added, "That is why this trouble has come upon us." Reuben spoke up, wounded and angry. "Didn't I tell you not to sin against the boy? But you wouldn't listen." Genesis 42. Joseph's throat tightened. His eyes burned. The memory of the pit rose like a flood. For a moment he couldn't hold it. He turned away and wept, quietly, quickly, so no one would see. Genesis 42. He returned with his face set again, but his heart was shaken. They remembered. They admitted guilt. They spoke of his pain. Joseph chose Simeon to remain and had him bound before their eyes. The others were loaded with grain. But Joseph wasn't finished testing. Not yet. He secretly ordered his servants to return each man's money into his sack along with the food. Genesis 42. It was a strange kindness and a potential trap. If they were dishonest men, they might take it and run. If they were changing, fear and honesty would clash inside them. The brothers left Egypt, carrying grain and worry. And as they traveled back toward Canaan, Joseph remained behind, watching the dust trail fade, knowing this was only the beginning, because the real test wasn't the journey. It would be what they did when they stood before their father, and whether they would risk themselves for the brother they claimed to love. The road home felt longer than the road to Egypt. Each brother walked with grain on his animals, but fear on his shoulders. They kept replaying the governor's words. Spies, bring your youngest brother, one stays behind. Simeon's face, bound and taken away, wouldn't leave their minds. Then, at the first stopping place, one of them opened his sack to feed his donkey and froze. There, sitting on top, was his money. Every coin returned. His voice cracked as he called the others. My money has been put back. It's here in my sack. Genesis 42. Panic spread like fire. Hands trembled as other sacks were opened. More money appeared. Every man's payment returned in full. They stared at one another, hearts pounding. In Egypt, this could look like theft. It could look like a scheme. It could look like guilt, even if they were innocent. and guilt was already in their bones. "What is this that God has done to us?" they whispered. Genesis 42. Notice that. They didn't say bad luck. They said God. Conscience was awake now, interpreting everything through the lens of what they had done years earlier. When they reached Canaan, they found their father waiting, face lined with worry. Jacob's eyes searched their group and quickly counted. 10 returned. Simeon did not. Words spilled out as they told the story, the governor's harsh questions, the accusation of spying, the demand for Benjamin, the imprisonment, the new terms. Then they showed the grain. Jacob listened, growing pale, and when they finally revealed the money, returned to each sack, Jacob's fear turned into something heavier, grief mixed with anger. "You have bereaved me," he said. "Joseph is no more, Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin." Genesis 42. For Jacob, it was a pattern of loss, a father's nightmare repeating itself. He could not see God's plan, only the pain. Reuben stepped forward with a desperate offer. "Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back," he said. But Jacob refused. His voice shook with protective sorrow. "My son shall not go down with you." Genesis 42. So the brothers waited. They had food, for now. But famine doesn't negotiate. Days turned into weeks. The grain slowly disappeared. Animals weakened. The household stores ran low. Jacob's family felt the pressure again, the same hunger that drove them to Egypt in the first place. Eventually, the truth stood in the center of the camp like a wall. They would have to return, and they could not return without Benjamin. Jacob called his sons. "Go again," he said. "Buy us a little food." Genesis 43. Judah answered this time, not with anger, not with excuses, but with firm reality. "The man solemnly warned us," Judah said. "You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you." Genesis 43. Jacob argued, wounded. "Why did you tell the man you had another brother?" But the sons explained. The governor questioned them closely. They couldn't have predicted what would happen. Then Judah stepped forward again, and this time his words were different from Reuben's. Not dramatic, not reckless, responsible. "Send the boy with me," Judah said. "I will be a pledge for him. If I do not bring him back, I will bear the blame forever." Genesis 43. That line mattered. Judah wasn't offering his sons as a bargaining chip. He was offering himself. He was placing his own future on the line. Jacob looked at them, at the hunger, at the reality closing in. Finally, with a father's trembling surrender, he agreed. "Then do this," Jacob said, trying to grasp control where he could. "Take gifts, balm, honey, spices, myrrh, pistachios, almonds. Take double money, both the returned money and new payment, and take Benjamin." Genesis 43. Then Jacob spoke words that sounded like a prayer wrapped in sorrow. "May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may I not be bereaved." Genesis 43. So the brothers set out again, this time with Benjamin walking among them, Joseph's full brother, the last piece of the dream. As they traveled toward Egypt, they didn't know what waited ahead. But Joseph, back in the palace, was about to face a moment even harder than power, the moment he would see Benjamin's face again and have to decide what love and truth would require. The moment Joseph saw Benjamin, time seemed to bend. From his elevated seat, Joseph watched the brothers enter Egypt's storehouse court again, dusty, tense, carrying gifts and double money just as their father instructed. And there, walking among them, was the one face Joseph had not seen since boyhood. Benjamin, his mother's son, his own blood in the clearest sense. The sight struck Joseph like a wave that almost broke his composure. For a heartbeat, he forgot the throne, the ring, the chain, the Egyptian name. He saw his family as it once was, before betrayal, before loss, before years stolen. Joseph kept his voice steady. "Is this your youngest brother?" he asked. "The one you told me about?" Genesis 43. Benjamin nodded, eyes lowered, respectful, unsure. Joseph's chest tightened. He wanted to reach out, to pull him close, to say, "I'm here. I never stopped being your brother." But he didn't. Not yet. He still needed to know, had these men become protectors? Or were they still the kind who would sacrifice family to save themselves? So Joseph spoke a blessing, gentle and unexpected, from an Egyptian ruler. "May God be gracious to you, my son." Genesis 43. Then the emotion rose too fast. Joseph's eyes burned. He turned away quickly and left the room, stepping into a private chamber where he could breathe. And there, alone, he wept. Not loud, not theatrical, just the release of years. Genesis 43. When he returned, his face was washed, his posture controlled again. The mask of authority settled back into place. Joseph ordered a meal. The brothers were brought to his house, something that terrified them. They whispered to each other, convinced this was a trap. "He's bringing us in because of the money. He wants to seize us." Fear makes guilt speak in worst-case scenarios. At the doorway, they pleaded with the steward, explaining the money had somehow appeared in their sacks. They offered it back, plus more. Their words tumbled out, honest, anxious, desperate to be believed. The steward surprised them. "Peace to you," he said. "Do not be afraid. Your God has put treasure in your sacks. I received your money." Genesis 43. Then Simeon was brought out to them, alive. Relief washed over the group like rain after drought. Inside, servants poured water for their feet. Food was prepared. The brothers arranged their gifts, waiting for Joseph to enter. They were seated in order, from the oldest to the youngest, and the brothers stared at one another, stunned. How could he know our ages? Genesis 43. Then Joseph came in. They stood, bowed low, and presented the gifts. Joseph asked about their father's health. "Is your father well?" Genesis 43. They answered quickly, "He is well." Joseph's eyes moved to Benjamin again. His voice softened, just slightly. "Is this your youngest brother?" He looked at Benjamin with a tenderness he had to hide behind formal words. Then the meal began, and Joseph did something that felt like a spotlight. He sent portions from his table to them, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times larger. Genesis 43. The brothers noticed. Of course they did. Favoritism had once poisoned their home. This was the same kind of test. One brother honored above the others. Would envy rise again? Would anger flare? Or had God done something new in them? Joseph watched closely as they ate and drank and slowly, cautiously, began to relax. The room filled with laughter that hadn't existed between them in years. But Joseph's heart remained alert, because the next test would not be a feast. It would be a crisis, carefully designed to reveal whether these brothers would finally stand for the one they once would have abandoned. Morning came too quickly. The brothers woke in Joseph's house with full stomachs and guarded relief. For the first time since entering Egypt, it felt like the storm might be passing. Simeon was back with them. Grain was ready. No soldiers had dragged them away in chains. Maybe, just maybe, the governor's harshness had softened. Joseph let them believe it. He ordered his steward to fill their sacks with food, as much as they could carry. And again he had their money returned, each man's silver placed back in the mouth of his sack. But this time Joseph added something else, something sharp and deliberate, his own silver cup. The cup was placed in Benjamin's sack, hidden beneath grain, unseen by every brother. It wasn't a childish trick. It was a test engineered with precision. Joseph wasn't trying to punish. He was trying to discover the truth. When pressure hits, will they sacrifice Benjamin the way they sacrificed me? The brothers left at sunrise, animals loaded, spirits lifting as Egypt's gates slipped behind them. The road home opened ahead, and with every step, Jacob's tent felt closer. Then Joseph spoke to his steward. "Get up," he said. Pursue them. Genesis 44. The steward rode out fast, dust rising behind him. He caught them before they traveled far, calling out with authority. The brothers turned, startled, confused. "Why have you repaid good with evil?" the steward demanded. "Is this not the cup my lord drinks from? You have done wrong." Genesis 44. The brothers stared as if he'd accused them of stealing the sun. "What are you saying?" they protested. "We brought back the money we found before. How could we steal silver or gold from your master's house?" Genesis 44. Then, trying to prove their innocence, they made a vow too bold for their own good. "Whichever of your servants is found with it, let him die," they said, "and we also will be my lord's slaves." Genesis 44. The steward's reply was calmer, almost chilling. "Let it be as you say. Only the one with whom it is found shall be my slave." Genesis 44. Sacks were opened, one by one. The brothers stood in a line as the search moved from the oldest to the youngest. At first, nothing. Relief began to rise, fragile as a thread. Then the steward reached Benjamin. Hands lifted the sack's opening. Grain shifted. Something gleamed. The silver cup. Time froze. The brothers' faces drained of color. The world tilted. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't an accident. It felt like judgment catching up with them, like the past had finally turned around and run them down. They tore their clothes in grief, an outward sign of inner collapse. Genesis 44. Then, without even discussing it, they did something Joseph could not have predicted years earlier. They all turned back, all of them. No one said, "Benjamin did it, let him pay." No one said, "We tried our best." No one abandoned him on the road. Together, they returned to Joseph's house and fell before him on the ground, the same posture from Joseph's dream, now repeated under heavier meaning. Joseph looked down at them, voice stern. "What deed is this you have done?" he said. "Did you not know that a man like me can indeed practice divination?" Genesis 44. He wasn't confessing pagan magic. He was pressing the weight of authority, making them feel how powerless they truly were. Judah spoke for them, voice tight with shame. "What can we say? God has found out the guilt of your servants." Genesis 44. Notice the shift. They didn't only argue innocence, they acknowledged guilt, maybe not for the cup, but for the sin that still haunted them. Joseph pushed further. "The man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my slave, but as for you, go up in peace to your father." Genesis 44. There it was, the exact moment Joseph had been waiting for. An open door to repeat the old story. Go home without the favored brother. Leave Benjamin behind. Save yourselves. Years ago, they had chosen exactly that when Joseph was the one left behind. Now Joseph watched their faces, their silence, their breathing, waiting to see if anyone would stand up, speak up, pay a price. The room held its breath, and Judah, once the voice that said, "Let's sell him," stepped forward. This time, he wasn't offering a plan to get rid of a brother. He was about to offer himself. And Joseph's heart, hidden behind power, braced for what came next. Judah stepped forward slowly, like a man walking into fire on purpose. He didn't shout. He didn't argue, as if this were a courtroom. He spoke with the careful respect of someone who knew one wrong word could cost everything. "Oh, my Lord," Judah began, "please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's hearing, and do not let your anger burn." Genesis 44. Joseph watched him closely. This was the brother who once helped sell him, the brother whose voice had tipped the group toward betrayal. And now that same voice trembled, not with fear for himself, but with urgency for someone else. Judah started telling the story, patiently, step by step, repeating what Joseph already knew, but saying it out loud in a way that revealed the heart behind it. He explained how the governor had asked about their family, how they said they had a father and a youngest brother, how their father loved that youngest son deeply, because he was born in Jacob's old age and because his brother was gone. Genesis 44. Judah's words softened as he spoke of Jacob. His life, Judah said, is bound up in the boy's life. Genesis 44. Then Judah described their father's pain, how Jacob refused at first, how the famine forced their hand, how they could not return without Benjamin. Judah reminded Joseph that he himself had warned them, "You will not see my face unless your brother is with you." And then Judah confessed something that Joseph had never heard from them before, not openly, not like this. "I became a pledge for the boy," Judah said. "I told my father, if I do not bring him back, I will bear the blame forever." Genesis 44. Judah wasn't trying to escape consequences. He was accepting them. Then he brought the point down like a hammer, heavy, honest, unprotected by pride. "Now therefore," Judah pleaded, "please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a slave to my lord, and let the boy go up with his brothers." Genesis 44. It was a complete reversal of the past. Years ago, they had watched Joseph disappear to save themselves. Now Judah offered to disappear so Benjamin could live. Judah's voice broke as he finished, "For how can I go up to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would come upon my father." Genesis 44. That line wasn't strategy. It was love, not only for Benjamin, but for Jacob. Joseph felt it like an earthquake under a calm surface. This was what he needed to know. Not that they could cry, not that they could panic, but that they could sacrifice, that they were no longer the men who valued their own comfort over a brother's life. Joseph's hands tightened. His chest rose with a breath he couldn't control. He looked at Judah, really looked, and saw something different. A man who had been changed by time, guilt, and responsibility. The test was complete. And now Joseph faced his own decision. How long could he keep hiding? How long could he keep his identity buried under Egyptian power? His eyes burned again. Tears pressed hard against the wall of his restraint. Joseph signaled sharply, "Make everyone go out from me," he commanded. Genesis 45. Servants, officials, guards, everyone left. The room emptied until only Joseph and his brothers remained. The doors closed. The silence was thick. The brothers stood frozen, terrified. They didn't know what was about to happen. They expected punishment. They expected revenge. They expected the weight of Egyptian justice. And Joseph, alone with the men who broke his life, finally let the wall fall. He began to weep so loudly that it echoed through the palace halls. Genesis 45. His shoulders shook. Years of pain poured out all at once, betrayal, loneliness, fear, the long climb, the locked cell, the waiting. The brothers stared, confused, frightened, powerless. Then Joseph spoke, one sentence that split their world open. "I am Joseph." Genesis 45. The words hung in the air like thunder. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Genesis 45. Faces went blank. Mouths opened, but no sound came. Terror replaced confusion. They stepped back, as if the truth itself could strike them. Joseph saw their fear and moved toward them, not like a ruler, but like family. "Come near to me," he said. Genesis 45. They hesitated, and in that moment, Joseph didn't reach for revenge. He reached for redemption. Because the next words out of Joseph's mouth would define not only their future, but the meaning of everything that came before. The brothers stood as if their feet had turned to stone. "I am Joseph." Those words didn't just reveal a man. They resurrected a buried crime. In a single breath, the past came rushing back. The pit, the torn robe, the silver, the lie told to their father. Their faces tightened with shock and fear. Some looked ready to run. Some looked ready to collapse. Joseph saw it all, so he softened his voice. "Come near to me, please." Genesis 45. Slowly, hesitantly, they stepped forward. Close enough now to see his eyes clearly. Close enough to recognize something familiar in the shape of his face. Close enough to realize this wasn't a dream or a trap. And Joseph said it again, steady as an anchor. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Genesis 45. The words were honest, but Joseph didn't throw them like stones. He spoke them like truth that needed to be healed, not used as a weapon. Then he did something they could never have expected. He told them not to panic. Now do not be distressed, he said, and do not be angry with yourselves because you sold me here. Genesis 45. They stared at him disoriented. How could he say that? How could he stand in power and not crush them? Joseph continued, and his theology was as stunning as his mercy. God sent me before you to preserve life. Genesis 45. He wasn't denying their sin. He wasn't pretending it didn't happen. He was doing something bigger, placing their wrongdoing inside a greater story where God's purpose could still move forward. He explained the famine. It had already been 2 years, and 5 more were coming. Without provision, whole families and nations would break. But God had positioned Joseph in Egypt ahead of time to preserve a remnant and keep them alive by a great deliverance. Genesis 45. Then Joseph spoke the line that turned their guilt into awe. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Genesis 45. That didn't excuse them, but it meant their failure didn't get the final word. It meant God could take the darkest human choice and weave it into rescue. Joseph looked from face to face. Hurry, he urged. Go up to my father and tell him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. Genesis 45. He promised them safety, land, food, provision for their children. He told them he would care for them through the remaining years of famine. Then Joseph's composure broke again, but this time it wasn't grief. It was love. He turned to Benjamin, his full brother, the one he had not hugged since childhood. Joseph embraced him and wept. Benjamin clung to him, and he wept too. Genesis 45. The sound of it filled the room like rain finally falling after drought. Then Joseph embraced the others, each brother one by one. The very men who once treated him like a burden now felt his arms around them. And as he wept over them, something shifted inside the brothers. Fear loosened, replaced by a cautious, stunned relief. Afterward, they finally spoke with him, words stumbling out, voices uncertain. Genesis 45. The silence between them, built over decades, began to crack. News traveled fast in the palace. Joseph's brothers have come, people whispered. Pharaoh heard it, and it pleased him. Genesis 45. Pharaoh ordered provisions, wagons, supplies for the journey. He sent gifts and clothing, and Joseph added his own, especially for Benjamin, giving him more than the rest, not to provoke envy now, but as a sign that the old poison no longer ruled their family. Genesis 45. As the brothers prepared to leave, Joseph gave them one final instruction, quiet, practical, deeply human. Do not quarrel on the way. Genesis 45. He knew them. He knew what guilt can do when men start replaying blame. Joseph wanted them to bring peace home, not another fight. And so they departed Egypt with wagons and grain and a message too unbelievable to carry. Joseph is alive. The brother they betrayed was not dead. He was ruler in Egypt, and he had answered evil with mercy. Now one question remained, one Joseph couldn't control. How would Jacob respond when the sons who broke his heart returned with the news that could heal it? Because the next scene wouldn't be in a palace. It would be in a father's tent, where hope and grief would collide. The wagons creaked as they rolled north, heavy with grain and gifts, and heavier still with words that felt impossible to say out loud. Joseph is alive. The brothers rode with a strange mixture of relief and dread. Relief, because they weren't condemned. Dread, because they were about to face the one person they had lied to for years, their father. When they finally reached Canaan, the familiar hills rose in the distance. Jacob's tents came into view, and for a moment the brothers felt like boys again, standing on the edge of home, carrying secrets too big for their hands. Jacob came out to meet them, eyes searching. He saw the wagons first, Egyptian wagons, unmistakable. He saw the supplies, the abundance. Confusion crossed his face. Why would Egypt send this? Then his son spoke. Joseph is still alive, they said, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. Genesis 45. Jacob froze. The words didn't land as comfort. They landed as shock. His mind rejected them the way a body rejects poison. For years he had mourned Joseph as dead. Grief had dug trenches in his heart. You don't climb out of that easily. Genesis says it plainly. His heart became numb, for he did not believe them. Genesis 45. How could he? These were the same sons who once brought him Joseph's torn robe and let him drown in sorrow. They were asking him now to believe the opposite of everything he had lived with. So the brothers kept talking. They told him the words Joseph had spoken. They described the governor's mercy, the plan for survival, the invitation to come down. They showed the gifts, the grain, the clothing, and then Jacob's eyes fell on the wagons. Strong, real, physical proof sent by Joseph himself. Something in Jacob shifted. It wasn't instant joy. It was something quieter at first, like a candle relit in a room that had been dark for too long. Jacob's shoulders trembled. His breathing changed. Tears rose not only from happiness, but from the ache of realizing how much time had been stolen. And then, finally, the truth broke through his numbness. "It is enough," Jacob said. "Joseph, my son, is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." Genesis 45. Those words carried the weight of a lifetime. Jacob didn't say, "I can't believe it." He said, "I must see him." Hope had become a journey. So Israel, Jacob, now called by his covenant name, gathered his household. People packed what they could. Herds were moved. Children were lifted into wagons. Tents were folded. The whole family prepared to relocate because survival demanded it, and because a father's love demanded it more. On the way, Jacob stopped at Beersheba, a place layered with memory. It was where Abraham had worshipped, where Isaac had called on the Lord. Jacob offered sacrifices there, seeking God in the middle of this massive decision. Genesis 46. That night, God spoke to Jacob in visions. "Jacob, Jacob," the Lord called. Jacob answered, "Here I am." And God said, "I am God. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for there I will make you into a great nation. I will go down with you, and I will surely bring you up again." Genesis 46. It was a promise wrapped around fear. God didn't deny the risk. He addressed it. He assured Jacob, "You are not walking into Egypt alone." The next morning, Jacob rose with a steadier heart. The journey continued, not just as migration, but as destiny. And in Egypt, Joseph received word that his father was coming. The ruler who managed famine relief, who commanded storehouses, who stood second only to Pharaoh, suddenly became something else entirely, a son waiting to embrace his father. He ordered his chariot prepared, because the next scene would not be a political moment. It would be a family moment, one that would heal decades of grief in a single embrace. And Joseph's heart, long trained to endure, began to race like that 17-year-old dreamer again. Joseph didn't wait. The moment he heard his father had entered Egypt, he moved like a man chasing a miracle. His chariot was prepared, horses stepping fast, wheels humming over the road. Officials may have followed at a distance, but this wasn't a state visit in Joseph's heart. This was a son running toward the one face he thought he'd never see again. They met in Goshen. Jacob's wagon slowed, dust settling around the camp. Tents were being raised, families gathering, children staring wide-eyed at Egypt's sky. And then, from the distance, a chariot approached, royal, shining, unmistakable. Jacob lifted his eyes. Joseph stepped down. For a split second, the world went silent. Joseph looked older than the boy Jacob had lost, stronger, dressed like a ruler. But when Jacob saw his eyes, when the father recognized the son, everything else fell away. Joseph ran to him. He embraced Jacob and wept on his neck for a long time. Genesis 46. It wasn't a quick hug. It was years collapsing into one moment. It was grief melting. It was love refusing to let go. Jacob's arms tightened around Joseph as if letting go might wake him from a dream. Then Jacob spoke, voice shaking with relief. Now let me die, since I have seen your face and know that you are still alive. Genesis 46. It wasn't despair. It was a man saying, my deepest sorrow has been healed. My heart can rest. Joseph turned quickly to practical matters. His family had arrived with many people and animals. Egypt needed to know. Pharaoh needed to approve their settlement. And Joseph was wise enough to protect them culturally as well as physically. He instructed his brothers, when Pharaoh asks your occupation, say you are shepherds, not because it sounded impressive, but because it was true, and because Egyptians generally looked down on shepherds, meaning Pharaoh would likely allow them to live separately in Goshen, away from the pressures of assimilation. Genesis 46. Joseph then went to Pharaoh and reported his father and brothers had come with their flocks, and they were in Goshen. Pharaoh welcomed the news. He offered them the best of the land and gave permission for them to dwell there. Genesis 47. Joseph brought in a few of his brothers to meet Pharaoh. They bowed respectfully. Pharaoh asked, "What is your occupation?" They answered exactly as Joseph advised. "Your servants are shepherds." Genesis 47. Then Jacob himself was brought before Pharaoh. Imagine that moment. A shepherd patriarch, weathered by age and grief, standing before the ruler of the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh might have expected fear, but Jacob carried something else. Quiet authority, born of walking with God. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Genesis 47. Pharaoh asked Jacob his age, and Jacob answered with a line that feels like a whole life condensed. The years have been few and difficult. Genesis 47. Jacob didn't glamorize his story. He told the truth, yet he stood there alive, still worshiping, still blessing. After that, Joseph settled his family in Goshen. He provided for them through the famine, giving them food according to their households. Genesis 47. Outside Goshen, the famine tightened its grip. People from across Egypt came for grain. Money ran out, so they traded livestock. When livestock ran out, they offered land and labor in exchange for survival. Joseph managed the crisis with structure, preserving life on a national scale. Genesis 47. But in Goshen, something different was happening. Israel's family began to flourish. Children grew, families expanded. The very promise God gave Abraham, that his descendants would become many, was quietly unfolding in a foreign land. Joseph had risen to power, yes, but now, for the first time since the pit, he had what he wanted most: his father's presence, his family gathered, a future that didn't require forgetting. And yet, Joseph also knew that time keeps moving. Jacob was old, seasons change, and the story still carried unfinished threads, because the hardest forgiveness tests often come after the happy reunion. When the fear returns and asks, will mercy last when the protector is gone? That question was waiting just ahead, and Joseph, who had learned to trust God in pits and palaces, was about to show his brothers one final picture of grace, one that would echo far beyond their generation. Years passed, and Goshen became a place of shelter. Jacob's family grew strong there, even while famine reshaped nations. But time kept moving, and eventually Jacob grew weak. Joseph came to his father's bedside, and Jacob, hands trembling, spoke blessings over Joseph's sons, then over all his children. He reminded them that God had guided him through every hard road. Genesis 48:49. When Jacob died, grief filled the camp. Joseph wept over his father and honored him, ensuring he was buried in the family's land, just as Jacob had asked. Genesis 50. But after the funeral, a new fear rose in the brothers. They looked at one another and thought, now that our father is gone, what if Joseph finally pays us back? Guilt has a long memory. Even forgiven people can struggle to believe forgiveness will last. So they sent a message to Joseph, begging for mercy, calling themselves his servants. Genesis 50. When Joseph heard it, he wept, not because he was angry, but because they still didn't understand his heart. He called them close and spoke words that became the final heartbeat of his story. Do not be afraid. Genesis 50. Then he said the line that explains everything: the pit, the prison, the palace, the famine, the reunion. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to save many lives. Genesis 50. Joseph didn't deny their sin. He named it, but he also named God's power to redeem what humans break. And then he did what mercy always does. He acted. I will provide for you and your little ones, Joseph promised, and he comforted them, speaking kindly to their hearts. Genesis 50. That's the real ending. Not revenge, but restored family. Not bitterness, but blessing. Not a man shaped by trauma, but a man shaped by God. Joseph lived to see generations grow, and before he died, he reminded his family that Egypt was not their final home. God will surely visit you, he said, and bring you up from this land. Genesis 50. Joseph's story closes with faith forward, eyes on God's promise, because even when life throws you into a pit, God can lift you into purpose. Even when people betray you, God can build rescue through your endurance. And even when forgiveness feels impossible, God can make a heart so strong that it chooses mercy again and again.